My name is Amélie, and I'll never forget that day. It was a Tuesday morning, the sun shining through the curtains in our bedroom, when my husband, Pierre, received a call from his mother, Giselle. I knew immediately that something was wrong. Pierre was speaking in a low voice, casting furtive glances in my direction. My heart clenched, sensing that this conversation was about to turn our daily lives upside down. "Darling," Pierre said as he hung up, "my mother is organizing a family trip next month. The whole family will be there." His tone was hesitant, as if he feared my reaction. I smiled, naively thinking that this was good news. After all, it had been months since we'd seen his entire family. "That's great," I replied enthusiastically. "Where are we going?" Pierre's face darkened. He looked away, staring at an invisible dot on the wall. "Actually, Amélie, my mother thinks this trip should be reserved for immediate family members." I felt my smile freeze. "What do you mean? I'm your wife, I'm part of the family, aren't I?" Pierre sighed deeply. "My mother, she thinks daughters-in-law aren't really part of the family. She wants it to be just us, her children and grandchildren." Those words hit me like a slap in the face. I felt my cheeks flush with humiliation. "And you, what do you think?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Pierre shrugged, obviously uncomfortable. "You know my mother, Amélie. She can be stubborn. I don't want to create conflict." I felt anger rise in me. "So you agree with her? You think I'm not part of the family?" "It's not that," he protested weakly. "It's just this once. Don't take it personally." But how could I not take it personally? I'd been married to Pierre for 5 years. We'd built a life together, shared moments of joy and sadness. And then his mother unilaterally decided that I wasn't family, and my husband didn't have the courage to object. The next few days were a nightmare. Pierre was packing his bags, talking enthusiastically about the trip ahead, as if my exclusion were an insignificant detail. I tried to hide my pain, but every time I saw him packing, it was as if a knife was being plunged into my heart. I tried to talk to Giselle, hoping perhaps to change her mind. I plucked up my courage and called her. "Hello, Giselle," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and composed. "Ah, Amélie," she replied coldly. "What can I do for you?" I took a deep breath. "I wanted to talk to you about the family trip. I was wondering if..." She cut me off before I could finish. "Amélie, my dear, I think Pierre has explained. This trip is for the immediate family. You understand, don't you?" Her voice was sweet, but I could feel the venom behind her words. "But Giselle, I'm Pierre's wife. Am I not family?" She laughed, a sound that chilled my blood. "My dear, marriage doesn't make you a Dubois. You're a Lefevre who married a Dubois. It's not the same." His words hurt me deeply. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of hearing me cry. "I see," I said simply before hanging up. The day of departure finally arrived. Pierre loaded his suitcase into the car, ready to meet his family at the airport. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, heart heavy. "Are you sure you want to go?" I asked one last time, hoping against hope that he'd change his mind. Pierre sighed. "Amélie, we've already talked about this. It's important to my mother. I can't disappoint her." "What about me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I'm not disappointed in you, am I?" He came up to me, kissed me on the forehead. "It's only for a week. I'll call you every day, I promise." And then he drove off. I watched the car drive away, taking with it the man I loved, the man who had chosen his mother over his wife. I walked back into our house, suddenly too big, too empty, and let the tears I'd been holding back for days flow. This exclusion wasn't just painful, it was humiliating. I felt rejected, as if 5 years of marriage meant nothing. As if all the efforts I'd made to fit into this family had been for nothing. That evening, lying alone in our bed, I thought back to all the times Giselle had made me feel I wasn't up to scratch. The little remarks about the way I cooked, about my work, about the fact that Pierre and I didn't have any children yet. I'd always put it down to his difficult personality, but now I saw things differently. This wasn't mere criticism, it was outright rejection of me. And Pierre, my Pierre, who had failed to stand up for me. who had chosen the comfort of not upsetting his mother rather than supporting his wife. I wondered if our marriage meant as much to him as it did to me. If he really saw me as his partner, his equal, or if I was just an afterthought in his life. That night, I cried until I had no tears left. The pain of exclusion, Pierre's betrayal, Giselle's contempt, all mixed together in my heart, creating a storm of emotions I didn't know how to soothe. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a throbbing headache. I looked at my phone, hoping for a message from Pierre. No message. Not even a note to tell me they'd arrived safely. This lack of news only accentuated my feeling of abandonment. I spent the day wandering around the house, unable to concentrate on anything. Every object reminded me of Pierre, our life together, and the way he had left me behind without hesitation. I tried to work, to distract myself, but my thoughts kept coming back to this situation, to this family that didn't want me. In the evening, as I was mechanically preparing dinner for someone, my phone rang. It was Pierre. My heart leapt, a mixture of hope and apprehension. Amélie? Her voice sounded distant, almost foreign. Yes, Pierre, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. I just wanted to tell you that we've arrived safely. The weather is beautiful here. I felt anger rise in me. The weather? Is that what he wanted to talk to me about? Is that all you have to say to me? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. There was an awkward silence on the other end of the line. Look, Amélie, I know you're upset, but... I didn't let her finish. Upset? Pierre, I'm hurt, humiliated. Your mother has excluded me from the family and you've done nothing to defend me. How do you think I feel? My mother has her reasons, he began, but I cut him off. Her reasons? What reasons could justify treating your wife like a stranger? Pierre sighed. You don't understand. It's complicated. These words were the last straw. No, Pierre, what's complicated is being married to a man who doesn't know where his priorities lie. Enjoy your vacation. I hung up, my hands trembling, my heart beating wildly. For the first time since the beginning of this story, I felt not just sadness, but anger. An anger directed not only at Giselle, but also at Pierre, and at myself for having let this situation happen. That night, lying in our oversized bed, I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. I didn't know what yet, or how, but I knew I could no longer be the woman who accepted being left out, who let others decide her place in the family. As I finally drifted off to sleep, a thought occurred to me. Perhaps this painful exclusion was the beginning of something new. The beginning of a change I'd never dared to contemplate before. And with that thought, despite the pain and humiliation, I felt a spark of hope ignite within me. The alarm clock rang, as it does every morning, but this time I had no desire to get up. The bed seemed too big, too empty without Pierre beside me. I stared at the ceiling, thinking back to the previous day's telephone conversation. The anger that had overwhelmed me had faded somewhat, giving way to a confused mix of emotions, sadness, disappointment, and a deep sense of loneliness. I finally forced myself to get up, dragging my feet to the kitchen. The house was silent, too silent. Pierre usually made coffee while I showered. I missed the smell of freshly ground coffee and the familiar sound of the pot. I mechanically prepared my breakfast, but the food seemed bland and tasteless. Looking out of the window, I saw the neighbors off to work, their children off to school. Life went on as normal for everyone except me. I felt like I was in a bubble, isolated from the rest of the world. I decided to take a day off. The idea of going into the office and pretending everything was fine seemed insurmountable. I sent a quick email to my boss, claiming to have a headache. The day dragged on and on. I spent hours sitting on the sofa, flipping through the channels without really watching TV. My thoughts kept returning to Pierre, to his family, to the trip from which I'd been excluded. I thought back to all the times I'd felt I wasn't really accepted by Pierre's family. Giselle's little remarks, the sidelong glances at family gatherings, the conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room. Had I been blind all this time? Or had I simply chosen to ignore these signs, hoping that in time I would be accepted? That evening, I still hadn't heard from Pierre. I stared at my phone, reluctant to call him. But what would I say? I couldn't find the words to express the depth of my hurt and disappointment. The second day was similar to the first. I forced myself to go to work, but my mind was elsewhere. My colleagues noticed my gloomy mood, but I brushed off their concerns with a forced smile. Just a little tired, I told them. But inside, I was bubbling over. That evening, when I got home, I did something I'd never done before. I opened a bottle of wine and drank, alone. The bitter taste of the red wine seemed to reflect the bitterness I felt. Glass after glass, I felt my sadness turn to anger. Why had I let this happen? Why hadn't I pressed Pierre harder? Why had I accepted being treated like a stranger by his family all these years? On the third day, anger took over. I woke up with a new determination. I couldn't go on like this. Something had to change, and that change had to start with me. I spent the day thinking about my life, my marriage, my place in this family. I realized that since I'd married Pierre, I'd gradually lost sight of who I was. I'd tried so hard to fit in, to please his family, that I'd forgotten my own desires, my own aspirations. I remembered the young woman I had been before I met Pierre. Ambitious, independent, full of dreams. What had become of those dreams? I'd put them aside, thinking that was the price I had to pay to be part of this family. But at what price? On the fourth day, I made a decision. I was going to take control of my life. I spent the day researching on the internet, reading articles on assertiveness, on how to rebuild yourself after a betrayal. I created a list of things I wanted to accomplish, goals I'd abandoned over the years. Take up painting again, travel on my own, maybe even change careers. These ideas, which would have terrified me just a few days ago, now seemed exciting, full of possibilities. On the fifth day, I decided to get out of my bubble. I called my best friend, Sophie, whom I'd been neglecting lately. I told her everything, my voice trembling, tears flowing freely. "Oh, Amélie," she said softly. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I realized then how isolated I'd become, how much I'd let my life revolve around Pierre and his family. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I guess I was ashamed. I felt like if I talked about it, it would make it real." Sophie listened patiently, letting me vent. Then she said something that made me think. "Amélie, have you considered that this situation could be an opportunity?" "An opportunity?" I repeated, incredulous. "Yes," she said. "An opportunity to redefine who you are, what you want. An opportunity to show Pierre and his family that you don't need their approval to be happy." Her words resonated with me. She was right. This painful exclusion could be the catalyst for positive change in my life. On the sixth day, I woke up with a new energy. I spent the day sorting through my belongings, throwing away or giving away anything that reminded me too painfully of Pierre or his family. It was as if I were cleaning up not only my physical space, but also my mind. At the bottom of a drawer, I found an old sketchbook. I opened it and was overwhelmed with emotion at the sight of my old drawings. I remembered the joy of art, the way it allowed me to express myself. Why had I stopped? I spent the rest of the day drawing, letting my emotions guide my hand across the paper. The resulting images were dark, chaotic, but also full of a strength I didn't know I had. On the seventh day, exactly 1 week after Pierre's departure, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew what I had to do. I sat down at my desk and started writing a letter to Pierre. Not to ask him to come back, not to beg him to defend me to his family. No, this letter was for me. To put into words what I was feeling, to express everything I'd been holding inside for so long. "Dear Pierre," I wrote. "This week without you has been one of the most difficult of my life. But it's also been one of the most revealing. I realized how much I'd lost sight of who I was, how much I'd let your family define my worth." The words flowed freely, expressing my anger, my disappointment, but also my determination to change things. "I can't go on like this," I continued. "I deserve better than to be treated like a stranger by your family. I deserve better than to have a husband who won't stand up for me. But most of all, I deserve to respect myself." As I wrote these words, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time since the beginning of this ordeal, I felt strong, able to face what was to come. I don't know what the future holds, I concluded. But I do know one thing. I will never again be the woman who accepts being pushed aside. I'm better than that. We're better than that. I signed the letter, folded it carefully and put it away in a drawer. I didn't know if I'd ever give it to Pierre. Maybe these words were just for me, a way of turning the page. This week of solitude and reflection had changed me. The pain was still there, the anger too. But there was something else now. Hope. Determination. And above all, a renewed sense of who I was. I looked out the window. The sun was rising, illuminating the sky with bright colors. A new day was dawning. And with it, a new Amélie. On the 8th day after Pierre's departure, I woke up with a strange feeling of calm. The week of reflection had allowed me to step back and regain some semblance of balance. I got ready for work, determined to get on with my life, with or without Pierre. The morning passed quickly, my mind occupied with the daily tasks. It was around noon that everything changed. My phone rang, displaying Pierre's name. My heart leapt in my chest. Part of me wanted to ignore the call, but another, stronger part urged me to pick up. "Hello," I said, my voice more assured than I'd expected. "Amélie." Pierre's voice was strained, almost unrecognizable. "Amélie, I need your help." I sensed immediately that something was wrong. Pierre, usually so composed, seemed on the verge of panic. "What's going on, Pierre?" I asked, my throat tightening. There was a moment's silence, then Pierre dropped the bomb. "It's Mum. She's had an accident. She's in hospital." My mind suddenly went blank. Despite everything that had happened, despite the pain and anger, I felt a wave of worry wash over me. "Oh my God, Pierre. What's happened? Is she all right?" Pierre took a deep breath. "She fell down the hotel stairs. The doctors say she's lost a lot of blood. She needs an urgent transfusion." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. "A transfusion?" I repeated, incredulous. "Yes," Pierre continued, his voice trembling. "And that's when. Amélie, you're the only compatible person in the family." The world seemed to stop around me. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. I, the one who had been excluded from this family, was now the only one who could save Giselle. "How is this possible?" I asked, still in shock. Pierre quickly explained. Apparently, Giselle had a rare blood type. During a previous hospital stay, the whole family had been tested for potential donors. I was the only match. "Amélie," Pierre said, his voice breaking. "I know I have no right to ask you this. Not after everything that's happened. But please, can you come? Mommy needs you." I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. The anger was still there, the pain of exclusion still fresh. But there was also compassion, a sense of responsibility I couldn't ignore. "Where are you?" I finally asked. Pierre gave me the name of the hospital and the town. It was several hours away. "I'm on my way," I said simply before hanging up. The next few hours passed in a fog. I called my boss to explain the situation, packed a few things into a bag and set off. On the way, my mind kept returning to the irony of the situation. Giselle, who had always made me feel like I wasn't really family, was now depending on me for her survival. I arrived at the hospital in the late afternoon. Pierre was waiting for me at the entrance, looking exhausted and defeated. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. "Amélie," he said, coming closer. "You came." I simply nodded, unable to find the right words. Part of me wanted to hug him, to comfort him. Another part wanted to yell at him, ask him why he'd left me behind, why he hadn't come to my defense. "How is she?" I asked instead. Pierre shook his head. "Not good. The doctors say the transfusion is urgent." We headed for the appropriate department. On the way, I passed the rest of Pierre's family. His brothers and sisters, their spouses, all looked at me with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. I felt like a stranger once again, but for a completely different reason this time. The formalities for the blood donation were quickly settled. As I lay in the hospital bed, the needle in my arm, I couldn't help thinking about the absurdity of the situation. My blood was about to flow into the veins of the woman who had rejected me. Life certainly had a peculiar sense of humor. After the transfusion, the waiting began. The hours passed slowly in the hospital waiting room. Pierre's family was gathered, talking in hushed tones. I stayed on the sidelines, not really sure where I belonged. It was around midnight when the doctor came to see us. His face was grave, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "The transfusion was a success," he announced. "Madame Dubois is stable. The next few hours will be crucial, but we're optimistic." A collective sigh of relief ran through the room. Pierre turned to me, his eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "Amélie, I don't know how to thank you." I simply nodded, physically and emotionally exhausted. The next few days were a whirlwind of hospital visits, whispered conversations in the corridors, and endless waiting. Giselle's condition was slowly but surely improving. And little by little, I sensed a subtle change in the family's attitude towards me. The sidelong glances had disappeared, replaced by grateful smiles. Conversations no longer stopped when I entered a room. On the contrary, I was asked my opinion and included in the discussions. It was on the 4th day after the transfusion that Giselle asked to see me. I entered her hospital room with trepidation, not knowing what to expect. Giselle was lying on her bed, pale and frail. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Amélie," she said in a weak voice. "My dear Amélie." I approached the bed, my heart pounding. Giselle held out a trembling hand toward me. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I've been so unfair to you. And yet you came. You saved my life." I felt my own eyes mist over with tears. All the anger, all the resentment I'd built up seemed to melt away in the face of this woman's vulnerability. "It was the right thing to do," I said simply. Giselle shook her head. "No, it was much more than that. You showed a strength and compassion I never recognized in you. I was blind, Amélie. Blind and stupid." We talked for a long time that day. Giselle told me about the fears and insecurities that had led her to reject me. She had been afraid of losing her son, afraid that I would take his place in her heart. Now she realized how wrong she'd been. On my way out of the room, I passed Pierre in the corridor. He looked at me with eyes filled with love and remorse. "Amélie," he began. "I don't know where to begin. I'm so sorry. I should have stood up for you. I should have." I raised a hand to stop him. "Pierre, we have a lot to discuss. This is neither the time nor the place. But I think we've all learned a lot from this experience." He nodded, tears in his eyes. As I left the hospital that evening, I realized that this desperate call had indeed turned the tide. Not just for Giselle, whose life had been saved, but for the whole family. And for me. I didn't know exactly what the future held. There were still many things to say, many wounds to heal. But for the first time in a long time, I felt I belonged. Not because I'd given blood, but because I'd shown who I really was. And this person, this strong and compassionate Amélie, deserved to be respected and loved. The sun was setting over the city as I drove home. A new phase in my life was beginning. A phase where I would no longer be the outsider, but a full-fledged member of this complicated family. And above all, a phase where I would remain true to myself, no matter what. The days following Pierre's call were a whirlwind of emotions and intense reflection. As I prepared to return to the hospital, I was faced with a moral dilemma that was tearing me apart inside. On the one hand, there was this woman, Giselle, who had hurt me deeply by excluding me from the family, by making me feel like an outsider for years. The anger and pain of this rejection were still alive in my heart. Part of me wanted to tell her no, to show her that she couldn't just use me when she needed me and ignore me the rest of the time. On the other hand, there was this life at stake. No matter what Giselle had done to me, could I really refuse her help when she desperately needed it? Wasn't this my chance to show that I was better than her, that I was capable of compassion even towards those who had hurt me? I spent hours weighing up the pros and cons, imagining the different scenarios. If I refused to go, I might free myself from the grip of this toxic family, but could I live with the weight of this decision on my conscience? If I went, wouldn't I risk falling back into the same pattern, being exploited and pushed aside again once the crisis was over? It was finally a conversation with my best friend, Sophie, that helped me see things more clearly. "Amelie," she said softly over the phone, "I understand your anger and your pain. But think about this. When you go, you're not doing it for Giselle or even for Pierre. You're doing it for you, for the person you are, for your values." Her words resonated with me. She was right. This decision wasn't about them, it was about me. Which person did I want to be? The one who turned her back on someone in need out of vengeance, or the one who was able to rise above pettiness and do what was right? It was with this new perspective that I set off for the hospital. The journey was long and lonely, giving me plenty of time to reflect. I thought back to all the difficult times with Pierre's family, all the times I'd felt out of place. But I also thought of the good times, the shared laughter, the lively family meals. As I drove, the landscape flashed before my eyes. Green fields gave way to dense forests, then picturesque little towns. Every kilometer seemed to bring me closer not only to the hospital, but also to a stronger, wiser version of myself. Halfway along the road, I stopped at a small rest area. Sitting on a bench, watching the sun set over the horizon, I took out my diary. I'd made a habit of writing my thoughts in it since the beginning of this ordeal, and I needed to put into words what I was feeling. "Dear me," I wrote, "today I'm making a choice. A choice that is not easy, but one that is right. I choose not to let bitterness and resentment dictate my actions. I choose to be the person I've always wanted to be, strong, compassionate, forgiving. This journey isn't just about saving Giselle's life. It's about saving myself, about freeing myself from the weight of anger and resentment." These words, once set down on paper, seemed to lighten the weight on my shoulders. I set off again with renewed determination. Arriving at the hospital, I was greeted by Pierre. His face bore the marks of worry and lack of sleep. When he saw me, his eyes lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Amelie," he said softly, "you've come." I simply nodded. "How is she?" I asked. Pierre explained the situation. Giselle's condition was stable, but critical. The transfusion was scheduled for the following morning. As we walked through the aseptic corridors of the hospital, I felt the eyes of the other family members on me. Some seemed surprised to see me, others grateful. I noticed that their attitude had changed. There was none of the coldness and distance that had hurt me so much in the past. That night, I slept very little. Lying on the uncomfortable bed in the hotel room, I couldn't stop thinking about what was in store for me the next day. I wondered how Giselle would react when she saw me, what she would say. Part of me hoped for an apology, an acknowledgement of all the hurt she'd caused me. Another part knew not to expect gratitude or miraculous change. The morning came too quickly. As I prepared for the transfusion, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The face staring back at me was that of a stronger, wiser woman than the one who'd been excluded from the family trip a few weeks earlier. At the hospital, everything went quickly. The nurses prepared me for the blood donation, patiently explaining the procedure. As the needle penetrated my skin, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. This gesture, simple as it was, represented so much more than a simple donation of blood. It was an act of forgiveness, compassion, and self-affirmation. After the transfusion, I was kept under observation for a few hours. Pierre stayed by my side, silent but present. I could sense that he wanted to say something, perhaps apologize, but this was neither the time nor the place. It was late afternoon when I finally got to see Giselle. Entering her hospital room was one of the most difficult moments of my life. The woman lying on the bed looked so fragile, so far from the imposing, intimidating figure I'd always known. When she opened her eyes and saw me, her face changed. Tears rolled down her pale cheeks. "Amelie," she whispered in a weak voice. "You came." I approached the bed, not sure what to say or do. Giselle held out a trembling hand towards me. After a moment's hesitation, I took it in mine. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I've been so unfair to you. I don't deserve your kindness." These words, which I had so hoped to hear for years, struck me with unexpected force. I felt my own tears fall. "Giselle," I said softly, "what matters is that you're better now. We talked for a long time." Giselle told me about her fears, her insecurities that had led her to reject me. She now realized how wrong she'd been about me, how unfair she'd been. As I left her room, I felt strangely light. The forgiveness I'd offered wasn't just for Giselle, I realized. It was also for myself. I was freeing myself from the weight of resentment and bitterness I'd carried for so long. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions and difficult but necessary conversations. Pierre and I talked at length about our marriage, his choices, and my expectations. With the rest of the family, there were apologies, explanations, and promises to do better in the future. As I prepared to return home, I realized that this trip had been much more than just a physical journey. It had been an inner journey, a path to healing and forgiveness. On the plane home, I pulled out my journal again. "Dear me," I wrote, "you faced one of the greatest challenges of your life. You have chosen compassion over revenge, forgiveness over resentment. This choice doesn't erase the past, but it does open the door to a better future. You proved your strength, not by remaining inflexible, but by having the courage to forgive. This trip has changed you, and that's a good thing. You're stronger now, wiser, more compassionate. Never forget this lesson." As the plane landed, I felt I was coming home not just physically, but emotionally too. I had found my place, not in the eyes of others, but in my own heart. And that was the greatest victory of all. The weeks that followed my return home were a time of transition and adjustment. The family dynamic had changed dramatically, and I found myself navigating uncharted waters, both exciting and intimidating. The first tangible sign of this change came in the form of a phone call from Giselle, about a week after my return. Her voice, still weak but determined, echoed through the receiver. "Amélie, my dear, how are you?" I was surprised by the warmth of his tone, so different from the coldness I was used to. "I'm fine, Giselle. How about you? How are you feeling?" "I'm recovering slowly," she replied. "But it's not to talk about my health that I'm calling you. I wanted to thank you again. And to apologize to you, in person." I felt my throat tighten. "Giselle, you don't have to." "Yes, I do, Amélie," she interrupted me gently. "I have a lot to make up for. My behavior toward you has been inexcusable all these years. I was blinded by my own insecurities, my fear of losing my son. I failed to see the extraordinary woman you are." Her words touched me deeply. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing years of resentment and pain. We talked for over an hour that day, touching on subjects we'd always carefully avoided before. That phone call marked the beginning of a new era in our relationship. Giselle called me regularly, taking a genuine interest in my life, my plans, and my hopes. Little by little, I could feel the walls I'd built to protect myself crumbling away. Pierre, for his part, seemed determined to repair the damage caused by his lack of support. He multiplied his little attentions and gestures of affection. One evening, as we sat on our sofa, he took my hand in his. "Amélie," he said, his eyes shining with emotion, "I know I've deeply disappointed you. I should have defended you, supported you. I realize now how cowardly I was." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "Pierre, it hurt so much. I felt like our marriage didn't matter to you." He squeezed my hand tighter. "I know, and I'll always blame myself for that. But I promise you, Amélie, things will be different now. You're my priority, you're my family." These words, which I had so hoped to hear, warmed my heart. However, I knew that healing would take time. Trust, once broken, can't be repaired overnight. The real test of this new family dynamic came a few months later, when Giselle offered to organize a big family meal for her birthday. The invitation was addressed to me personally, insisting that my presence was not only desired, but essential. On the big day, I stood in front of the family home, my heart pounding. Pierre squeezed my hand in a show of support. "Ready?" he asked softly. I took a deep breath and nodded. As soon as we crossed the threshold, I was surprised by the warm welcome we received. Giselle came towards me, her arms wide open. "Amélie, my darling, I'm so happy you're here." The embrace that followed was sincere, devoid of the tension I'd always felt before. Then I realized how things had changed. The meal was a revelation. For the first time, I felt truly included in the conversations, the family jokes, the shared memories. Pierre's siblings, who had always treated me with aloof politeness, now seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. Just as dessert was about to be served, Giselle stood up, drawing everyone's attention. "I have something to say," she announced. Her gaze fell on me, filled with an emotion I'd never seen before. "Amélie, I want everyone to know how grateful I am to have you in our family. You've shown us what it really means to be a family: unconditional love, forgiveness, compassion. I was blind for so long, but thanks to you, my eyes have been opened." Tears flowed freely down my cheeks, but for the first time, they were tears of joy, relief, acceptance. I felt Pierre's hand clasp mine under the table, his gaze filled with love and pride. That evening marked a turning point in my relationship with Pierre's family. The invisible barriers that had always kept me at a distance had crumbled. I was no longer the tolerated daughter-in-law, but a full-fledged member of the family. The months that followed were filled with moments of shared happiness. Sunday afternoons spent cooking with Giselle, exchanging recipes and confidences. Game nights with Pierre's brothers and sisters, filled with laughter and complicity. Family vacations where I no longer felt like an intruder, but an essential piece of the puzzle. However, the most profound transformation was the one taking place within me. The anger and bitterness that had long inhabited my heart gave way to an inner peace I'd never known before. I had learned the power of forgiveness, not only towards others, but also towards myself. One evening, as Pierre and I strolled hand in hand through our neighborhood, I suddenly stopped. "You know," I said, "I never thought I'd say this one day, but I'm grateful for everything that's happened." Pierre looked at me, surprised. "Really?" I nodded. "Yes. As difficult as it has been, this ordeal has made us all grow. It taught us the value of family, forgiveness, and unconditional love. Without her, we wouldn't be where we are today." Pierre drew me into his arms, kissing me tenderly. "You're right. You've made us all better, Amélie. Especially me." That night, as I lay in our bed, I thought about how far I'd come. From painful exclusion to unexpected reconciliation, each step had helped shape the person I had become. I had discovered a strength within myself that I never knew existed, an ability to forgive that had transformed not only my life, but that of an entire family. I realized that sometimes, the greatest wounds can lead to the most beautiful healings. That love, even when tested, can emerge stronger, deeper. That family is not just a matter of blood, but of choice, forgiveness, and acceptance. As I closed my eyes, lulled by Pierre's steady breathing beside me, I was overcome by a feeling of gratitude. Gratitude for the trials that had made us stronger. Gratitude for the family we had become. And above all, gratitude for the person I had become through this emotional journey. The next morning, I woke up with a new resolution. I was going to write our story, not to dwell on the past, but to celebrate our transformation. To show that even in the darkest of times, hope and love can triumph. And as I began to commit the first words of our story to paper, I realized that this was not an end, but a new beginning. The beginning of a life in which I was no longer the outsider, but an essential pillar of a family united by love, forgiveness, and mutual understanding. Our story was living proof that sometimes it takes a crisis to recognize what really matters. That family ties, even the most strained, can be mended with patience, compassion, and love. And that each of us has the power to transform tragedy into triumph, exclusion into inclusion, wound into healing. As I finished writing, I felt a deep peace come over me. Our journey had been difficult, but worthwhile. For at the end of the road, we had found much more than reconciliation. We had found a family, in the truest sense of the word.